Michael Carter almost kept driving. The traffic light at the empty intersection had just turned green, and the heater inside the car finally started pushing warm air across the windshield. Kelly was half asleep in the passenger seat, her forehead resting against the cold glass, the glow of Christmas lights passing across her face as they moved down the quiet street. Then Michael saw them. At first it was just a shape near the bus stop bench, a dark bundle against the metal pole. The kind of thing your eyes notice but your brain decides not to question. But the car slowed anyway. A woman sat there, shoulders hunched forward, arms wrapped tight around something pressed against her chest. The wind pushed strands of her hair across her face. Snow had begun to gather on the thin blanket around her legs. Kelly lifted her head. "Dad, stop." Michael didn't answer right away. The light behind them turned red again, and the baby started crying. The engine kept running. Michael didn't remember deciding to pull over. One moment the car was rolling forward through the green light, and the next it was drifting toward the curb beside the bus stop. Snow brushed softly against the windshield. Not heavy, just steady enough to make the street look empty. Kelly sat up straighter. "Dad." Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made him turn the wheel the rest of the way. The car stopped. For a moment neither of them moved. Michael's hand stayed on the steering wheel. The heat hummed through the vents. Outside, the wind pushed loose snow across the pavement in thin lines. The woman at the bus stop hadn't looked up yet. She was bent over slightly, arms wrapped around the bundle against her chest. The blanket looked thin, one of those cheap fleece ones people buy at gas stations. The baby cried again. It wasn't loud, just weak, tired. Kelly exhaled slowly beside him. "She's been here a while," she said. Michael didn't answer. He knew this part of the city well enough. The buses ran less often at night. On Christmas Eve, they almost stopped completely. He glanced at the empty road ahead, then at the rearview mirror. No other cars. He rubbed his thumb against the steering wheel leather, a habit he'd had for years when thinking. "We don't know what's going on," he said finally. Kelly looked at him. Her expression wasn't angry, just steady. "She has a baby." Michael stared through the windshield again. The wind picked up slightly, moving the loose strands of the woman's hair across her face. Her coat looked too thin for the temperature. The sleeves were pulled over her hands like she was trying to trap warmth inside the fabric. The baby shifted under the blanket. Michael watched the way she leaned down instinctively, pressing her cheek against the child's head. Not dramatic, just automatic. Like someone who had been doing it for a long time. Kelly reached for the door handle. "Wait," Michael said. She paused. He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe because once they stepped out of the car, the moment would change. Decisions would start forming whether he wanted them to or not. He turned the engine off. The sudden quiet inside the car felt heavier. "Stay here for a second," he said. Kelly didn't argue. Michael opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The air hit his lungs immediately, sharp and dry. Snow crunched under his shoes as he walked toward the bus stop. The woman noticed him when he was about 10 feet away. Her head lifted slowly. Her eyes moved over him quickly, coat, shoes, posture, the way people do when they've spent time around strangers they don't trust. Michael stopped a few feet away. Up close, she looked younger than he expected. Early 20s maybe. Her face was pale from the cold, and there were dark circles under her eyes that didn't look like they came from just one bad night. The baby shifted again. She adjusted the blanket carefully. "You waiting for the bus?" Michael asked. It sounded like a pointless question as soon as he said it. The woman hesitated before answering. "Yes." Her voice was quiet, rough from the cold. Michael glanced at the small schedule sign on the pole beside them. The last bus for this route had passed nearly 40 minutes ago. He didn't mention it. The baby let out another small cry. She rocked gently, barely moving her arms, just shifting her weight slightly to settle the child. Michael noticed the baby's hat. Too small. It barely covered the ears. "How old?" he asked. The woman looked down at the baby. 3 months. Snow had started collecting along the edge of the bench behind her. Michael studied the street again. "Still empty. You been out here long?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved past him toward the parked car. toward Kelly watching through the windshield. Something cautious settled in her expression. Just waiting for the bus, she repeated. Michael nodded slowly. He recognized that tone. It wasn't anger. It was distance. The kind people build when they expect kindness to come with conditions. Behind him, the passenger door of the car opened. Kelly stepped out before he could say anything. She walked toward them quickly, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The woman's shoulders stiffened. Kelly slowed when she reached him. Her eyes dropped immediately to the baby. "Oh," she whispered softly. The baby's face was barely visible under the blanket. Small, red from the cold. Kelly looked back up at the woman. "You must be freezing." The woman didn't respond. Kelly shifted her weight slightly, uncertain for a second, then slipped her scarf off and held it out. "Here." The woman stared at it. "You should keep it," she said. Kelly shook her head. "I'm going back into the car." A small lie. Michael noticed it immediately but didn't say anything. The woman hesitated. Then she slowly reached out and took the scarf. Her fingers were red and stiff. "Thank you," she said quietly. She wrapped the scarf around the baby first. Carefully. Slowly. Michael watched the way she tucked the fabric under the child's chin. Kelly noticed it too. "What's her name?" Kelly asked gently. The woman looked up again. "His," she said. Kelly blinked. "Oh, sorry." She leaned a little closer to see. "What's his name?" The woman hesitated. Then she said it. "Lucas." Kelly smiled softly. "Hi, Lucas." The baby made a small sound under the blanket. Michael shifted his stance, trying to ignore the cold starting to creep into his coat. "What's your name?" Kelly asked. The woman looked at her this time instead of Michael. "Grace." Kelly nodded. "That's a pretty name." Grace didn't react to the compliment. Her attention stayed mostly on the baby. Michael felt the cold working its way through his shoes now. He looked down the road again. Still no headlights. "You know the buses stopped running for tonight, right?" he said quietly. Grace's eyes flickered toward him. Just for a second. It was enough. She hadn't known. The realization passed through her face quickly, but it was there. Kelly saw it too. "Where were you trying to go?" Kelly asked. Grace's lips pressed together slightly. Michael could see the calculation happening. Every answer carried risk. Every silence did too. Grace looked back down at Lucas. "Anywhere warm," she said finally. The words came out almost under her breath. Not dramatic. Just honest. Michael felt something tighten in his chest that he hadn't expected. The wind moved through the bus shelter again. Lucas let out another weak cry. Kelly glanced at Michael. Not pleading, just waiting. Michael looked at Grace, at the thin coat, at the baby's tiny face pressed into borrowed fabric. He exhaled slowly. "You can't stay out here tonight," he said. Grace's eyes lifted again, guarded now. "I'll figure something out," she replied. Michael nodded. "I'm sure you will." A small pause, then he said it. "You and the baby can come warm up at our place for a bit." Grace stared at him. The snow kept falling around them. Kelly didn't speak. Grace's arms tightened slightly around Lucas. "I don't know you," she said quietly. Michael nodded once. "That's fair." Another pause. Then he gestured toward the car. "My daughter's already sitting in the passenger seat. You can sit in the back. Stay as long as you need to warm up." Grace looked between them. The wind pushed harder through the open street. Lucas cried again. Longer this time. Grace closed her eyes briefly, not thinking, just weighing. When she opened them again, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Okay," she said softly. Grace stood slowly. Her legs looked stiff, like they'd been still too long. When she shifted her weight, the thin blanket slipped slightly and she adjusted it quickly around Lucas. Michael stepped back to give her space. The wind moved through the bus shelter again, rattling the loose plastic panel behind the bench. Kelly walked ahead toward the car and opened the back door. "Careful," she said gently, brushing snow off the seat with her sleeve. Grace approached the car like someone entering a place she wasn't sure she belonged. Her eyes moved across the clean interior. The leather seats, the faint smell of pine from the small ornament hanging near the dashboard. She hesitated. Then she slid into the back seat, keeping Lucas pressed close against her chest. Kelly shut the door softly. Michael got back behind the wheel and started the engine again. Warm air began pushing through the vents almost immediately. In the rearview mirror, he saw Grace relax by a fraction. Not much. Just enough that her shoulders dropped slightly. Lucas made a small sound and shifted under the scarf. Grace adjusted the fabric again, careful not to wake him fully. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The heater hummed. The windshield wipers moved quietly across the glass. Outside, Christmas lights blurred through the falling snow as the car pulled away from the curb. Kelly turned halfway in her seat. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Grace looked up quickly. The question seemed to catch her off guard. "I'm okay," she said. Kelly nodded slowly. "That usually means yes." Grace didn't answer. Michael kept his eyes on the road. The streets were quieter now, most people already inside somewhere warm. Lucas let out another soft cry. Grace rocked him gently. The movement was automatic again, a small rhythm in her arms. Michael noticed the way she leaned her head down slightly while she did it, like she was listening for something. "You said he's 3 months," Kelly asked. Grace nodded. "Almost 4. Kelly smiled faintly. "He's tiny." Grace looked down at Lucas. He was early. Her voice softened when she said it. A small pause filled the car again. Michael turned onto a wider street leading toward the neighborhood where they lived. The houses there were older, large trees lining both sides of the road, most of them decorated tonight. Kelly watched the lights through the window. Grace noticed it too. Her eyes moved from one house to the next, each one glowing with warm windows and strings of color across the porches. Lucas finally settled. His breathing slowed under the blanket. Grace exhaled carefully, like she had been holding the tension in her chest for hours. Kelly turned again. "There's soup at home," she said. "My aunt made 2 much earlier." Grace looked uncertain. "You don't have to." "It's already there," Kelly interrupted gently. Grace went quiet again. Michael glanced briefly in the mirror. She looked smaller in the back seat than she had at the bus stop. The warmth inside the car seemed to be bringing the exhaustion back into her face. He had seen that before, people holding themselves upright until they finally reached somewhere safe enough to feel tired. "Where were you coming from tonight?" Michael asked. Grace hesitated. Her eyes shifted toward the window again. "Shelter," she said. The words sat in the air for a moment. "They closed early for the holiday." Michael nodded slightly. That explained the bus stop. Kelly's voice softened. "Did they help you find somewhere else?" Grace shook her head. "Most places were full." Lucas stirred again. Grace tucked the blanket tighter around him. Michael didn't ask anything else. The car turned into their neighborhood. The houses here sat farther apart, each one with long driveways and quiet yards covered in snow. Grace noticed the change immediately. Her posture straightened slightly. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Home," Kelly said simply. Grace looked toward the front seat again. Michael felt her eyes on him through the mirror. He kept his voice even. "We're almost there." The car turned into a long driveway lined with bare trees wrapped in small white lights. At the end of it stood the house. Not enormous, but large enough to feel intimidating to someone seeing it for the first time. Warm light spilled through the windows. Grace stared at it. "You live here?" she asked quietly. Kelly smiled a little. "Yeah." Michael pulled the car into the garage. The door closed behind them with a low mechanical hum. For a moment, no one moved again. Grace looked down at Lucas, then back at the house door leading inside. "You really don't have to do this," she said. Michael turned in his seat. His voice stayed calm. "It's just for the night." Grace studied his face, searching for something. People who had lived carefully learned to read small things. Tone. Eyes. The space between words. Michael didn't rush her. Lucas made a tiny sound under the blanket again. Grace looked down. Her fingers brushed gently across his cheek. Then she nodded once. "Okay." Kelly opened her door quickly and stepped out. Cold air rushed briefly into the garage. She hurried around to the back door and opened it. "Come on," she said softly. Grace stepped out slowly, holding Lucas close. The garage smelled faintly like cold concrete and pine from the wreath hanging on the door. Michael grabbed a small bag from the trunk and followed them inside. The warmth hit immediately. Soft light filled the hallway. From somewhere deeper in the house came the quiet sound of a television, and the faint smell of food still lingering from earlier. Grace stopped just inside the doorway. Her shoes left small wet marks on the wooden floor. Kelly disappeared for a moment and came back with a thick blanket. "Here," she said, draping it gently over Grace's shoulders. Grace didn't speak. She just pulled the blanket tighter around Lucas. Michael hung his coat by the door. When he turned back, Grace was still standing there, looking around the house, not with curiosity, more like someone stepping into a place that felt too calm to trust yet. Kelly noticed it too. "You can sit down," she said gently, pointing toward the living room. Grace walked slowly toward the couch. She lowered herself carefully onto the edge of it. Lucas remained asleep. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Michael stood near the doorway for a moment, watching. Grace's shoulders relaxed a little more with every second that passed. The warmth, the quiet, the stillness. Sometimes those things were harder to accept than the cold. Kelly returned from the kitchen carrying a bowl. Steam rose from it. She held it out carefully. "Just soup," she said. Grace stared at it. Then she looked up at Kelly. Her voice came out softer than before. "Thank you." Kelly nodded. Grace took the bowl with both hands. For a moment she didn't eat. She just held it there, feeling the heat against her fingers. Michael noticed the way her eyes closed briefly. Not long, just enough. Then she took the first spoonful, and something inside the room shifted. Small, quiet, but real. Michael leaned against the doorframe and watched. Outside, snow continued falling across the empty street. Inside, the house felt different than it had an hour earlier. Not louder, not brighter, just fuller. He didn't know yet what that meant. Only that stopping the car had changed something already, and the night wasn't finished with them yet. Grace finished the soup slowly. Not because it was hot. That cooled quickly. She ate slowly because the room was quiet, and the quiet felt unfamiliar. The clock on the wall ticked every few seconds. Somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked once, then settled again. Lucas slept against her chest. His breathing had changed since they came inside. Not tight anymore, not sharp, just small. Grace kept one hand on his back while she held the bowl in the other. She noticed everything. The weight of the blanket around her shoulders, the softness of the couch beneath her, the steady warmth moving through the room. Her eyes moved across the living room carefully. A shelf of books along one wall. Framed photos near the fireplace. A small stack of papers resting neatly on a table beside the chair where Michael now sat. It was the kind of room people lived in comfortably. Nothing expensive placed where it couldn't be touched. Nothing fragile sitting too close to the edge of anything. Kelly sat on the arm of the couch, watching Lucas more than anything else. "He's still sleeping," she whispered. Grace nodded slightly. "He does that when he's warm." Kelly smiled faintly. Grace lowered the spoon back into the bowl. There was a little soup left, but she set it down on the coffee table. Her stomach felt full faster than she expected. Michael noticed. "You can have more if you want," he said. Grace shook her head. This was enough. Her voice carried the same quiet restraint it had at the bus stop. Michael leaned back slightly in the chair. His posture relaxed, but his eyes stayed attentive. "Where were you staying before the shelter?" he asked. Grace looked down at Lucas. She didn't answer right away. Kelly shifted slightly, sensing the tension before it was spoken. Grace adjusted the blanket around Lucas again. "A friend's couch," she said. Michael waited. Grace continued after a moment. "They had family coming for Christmas." The explanation stopped there. It was enough. Michael had heard similar answers before in other contexts. Short, clean, just enough truth to move past the question. Kelly leaned forward a little. Do you have family nearby? She asked. Grace's eyes lifted briefly, then moved away again. No. The word wasn't bitter, just final. Lucas stirred slightly. Grace immediately placed her hand gently against his back again. Michael watched the instinct in that movement. Protective. Constant. How long have you been in the city? He asked. 6 months. Grace said it without looking up. The clock ticked again. Kelly studied her quietly for a moment. You don't sound like you're from here, she said. Grace gave the smallest hint of a smile. I'm not. Michael stood and walked slowly toward the kitchen doorway. Tea? He asked. Grace looked surprised. That's okay, she said. It's already boiling, Michael replied. Another small lie. Grace didn't challenge it. Kelly watched her father disappear briefly into the kitchen. Grace sat very still again. Her eyes moved toward the window. Snow pressed softly against the glass outside. For the first time that night, she seemed unsure what to do with her hands now that she wasn't outside in the cold. Kelly noticed. You can relax, she said gently. Grace looked at her. I am. Kelly didn't argue, but she knew the difference between sitting and resting. Michael returned with a mug a minute later. He set it carefully on the table beside Grace. Steam curled upward. Peppermint, he said. Grace wrapped her fingers around the mug after a moment. Warm, real warmth, not the kind that disappears the second you step away from it. She took a small sip. Lucas shifted again. Grace glanced down. He eats soon, she said quietly. Kelly nodded. We have a spare room upstairs. Grace's eyes lifted immediately. The hesitation returned. You don't have to. It's already made, Kelly said. Grace looked between them. Michael spoke calmly from his chair again. You can stay the night. Grace studied his face carefully. The same calculation from earlier returned. What do you want in return? She asked. Kelly blinked. Michael didn't react immediately. Grace's voice wasn't accusing, just careful. Michael rested his hands together. Nothing. Grace held his gaze. That's not usually how things work. Michael nodded once. You're right. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Grace looked down at Lucas again. Then she said something very quietly. I can clean. Kelly frowned slightly. You don't have to. I can cook, Grace added quickly. Or watch kids. Or help with anything. Michael leaned forward slightly. You already have a job tonight. Grace looked confused. Keeping him warm, Michael said, nodding toward Lucas. Grace's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. She didn't respond. Kelly saw the emotion move across her face before it disappeared again. Grace looked down quickly. The clock ticked again. Lucas made a soft sound. Grace shifted him gently, adjusting the blanket once more. Kelly stood up slowly. I'll get the room ready, she said. Michael glanced toward her. It's already ready, he said. Kelly smiled faintly. Then I'll find extra blankets. She walked toward the stairs. Grace watched her go. Then she spoke again quietly. You don't know me. Michael nodded. That's true. Grace waited. Michael leaned back again. But I know what cold looks like. Grace looked at him again. There was no judgment in his voice, just observation. The room stayed still again. Grace held the warm mug between her hands. Lucas slept peacefully against her chest. For the first time since they had met her, her shoulders lowered just a little more. Not completely, but enough to show the difference. Michael noticed it. Outside, the snow thickened slightly. Inside, the house stayed quiet. Grace looked around the room once more. This time, her eyes lingered on one of the photographs near the fireplace. It showed Michael standing beside Kelly several years younger, both smiling. Grace stared at it for a moment longer than the others. Then she looked away. Her voice came softer now. You really stopped for us? Michael answered without hesitation, yes. Grace didn't say anything else, but the way she held Lucas changed slightly, like the weight of the moment had finally begun to settle. And upstairs, the quiet house was preparing space for someone who had not expected to belong anywhere tonight. Lucas woke a little after the tea cooled. It started with a small sound in his throat. Not crying yet, just the restless shift babies make before they fully wake. Grace noticed immediately. Her hand moved gently across his back, fingers slow and careful. But Lucas stretched under the blanket, and this time the sound turned into a thin cry. Grace didn't panic. She simply lifted him higher against her shoulder and stood from the couch. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Michael shook his head. "You don't have to apologize." Grace bounced Lucas slightly in her arms, the same small rhythm she had used at the bus stop. But now the room was warm. The movement came slower. Lucas cried again. Kelly appeared halfway down the stairs carrying a folded blanket. "Is he hungry?" she asked softly. Grace nodded. Kelly stepped down the rest of the way. "You can use the guest room," she said. Grace hesitated. "You don't have to leave the room," Kelly added quickly. "I just thought you might want somewhere quieter." Grace looked down at Lucas again. His cries were growing louder now. The sound filled the room in a way that made Grace's shoulders tighten. Michael noticed. "You're not disturbing anyone," he said calmly. Grace gave a small nod, but she still looked toward the staircase. "Upstairs?" she asked. Kelly smiled gently. "Second door on the right." Grace adjusted Lucas in her arms and walked slowly toward the stairs. Her steps were careful, partly because she was tired, partly because the house still didn't feel like a place she could move freely inside. Kelly watched her reach the top before turning back toward Michael. They both listened as Grace's footsteps moved down the hallway. Then the soft click of a door closing. For a moment the house went quiet again. Michael leaned back slightly in the chair. Kelly sat down on the couch where Grace had been. The blanket she'd used was still draped over the cushions. Kelly touched the fabric lightly. "She thought we wanted something from her," Kelly said. Michael didn't answer immediately. "That's probably been true before," he said finally. Kelly looked toward the stairs. She looked scared to sit down. Michael nodded. "People get used to standing." Kelly pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders. "Do you think she's okay?" Michael glanced toward the hallway upstairs. "I think she's tired." The quiet stretched again. After a moment, Kelly spoke. "She's younger than I thought." Michael nodded. "She carries herself older." Upstairs, Lucas's crying softened. Grace's voice could be heard faintly through the ceiling. Not words, just the low sound people make when comforting a baby. Kelly smiled slightly. "She's good with him." Michael looked toward the staircase again. "Yes." The clock ticked steadily on the wall. Snow continued falling outside the tall living room windows. Kelly leaned her head back against the couch. "Dad." Michael looked at her. "Yeah, you weren't going to stop." The statement hung in the room quietly. Michael didn't rush to answer. "No," he said. Kelly nodded slowly. "But you did." Michael rested his hands together. "Yes." Kelly studied his face. "Why?" Michael looked toward the window. The street outside was empty now, just white snow collecting along the quiet curb. "I heard the baby," he said. Kelly smiled faintly. "That's it?" Michael considered the question. Then he nodded once. That was enough. Upstairs, the house shifted slightly as someone moved across the hallway floor. A few minutes passed. Kelly eventually stood. "I'll grab a bottle warmer," she said. Michael looked surprised. "We have one left over from when Aunt Maria visited last year," Kelly replied. Michael shook his head slightly. Kelly disappeared into the kitchen. Michael stayed in the chair. The house felt different now. The same furniture, same quiet walls, same lights glowing softly around the living room. But something had shifted. A presence, the small sound of Lucas moving upstairs, the soft creak of the floor above. Michael had lived in this house long enough to recognize its usual rhythm. Tonight, it was different. Kelly returned carrying a small box she had pulled from a kitchen cabinet. "Found it," she said. Michael raised an eyebrow. "You're very prepared." Kelly shrugged. "I watch a lot of my friends' babies." Michael gave a small smile. She set the bottle warmer on the kitchen counter and plugged it in. After a moment she paused and looked toward the stairs again. "You think she'll stay?" Michael leaned back slightly. For tonight. Kelly shook her head. I mean after. Michael didn't answer immediately. Upstairs, Lucas made a soft sound again. Grace's voice followed. Calm. Low. She probably doesn't know yet, Michael said. Kelly leaned against the counter. She didn't believe us. Michael nodded. Kindness confuses people when they're not used to it. Kelly folded her arms loosely. Are we going to help her? Michael looked toward the staircase again. The answer wasn't simple. Helping someone for a night was easy. Helping someone rebuild their life was different. It required time, patience, and a willingness to let your own life change shape. Michael understood that better than most. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Kelly studied him. You usually know things. Michael gave a quiet breath. Not tonight. The room settled again. A few minutes later, the upstairs door opened. Footsteps moved down the hallway. Grace appeared at the top of the stairs. Lucas rested quietly against her shoulder again. Grace paused when she saw them both looking up. He's sleeping, she said softly. Kelly smiled. Good. Grace walked slowly down the stairs, the thick blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. When she reached the bottom, she stopped near the couch. Thank you, she said. Not rushed, not automatic. She meant it. Michael nodded once. You're welcome. Grace looked around the room again. This time her eyes lingered a little longer. The warmth, the quiet, the safety. She sat down carefully on the couch again with Lucas resting against her chest. For the first time that night, she leaned back. Not just sitting, resting. Her eyes closed for a moment. Just a moment. But long enough that Kelly noticed. Michael noticed too. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the snow continued falling across the quiet neighborhood. Inside the house, something fragile had begun to form. Not trust yet, but the first space where it might eventually grow. And none of them fully understood yet how much that small beginning would change everything. Grace woke before the house did. The room was dim when she opened her eyes. Pale winter light pressed through the curtains, turning the ceiling a quiet shade of gray. For a moment she didn't move. Lucas slept beside her on the bed, wrapped inside the thick blanket Kelly had brought the night before. One tiny hand rested near his cheek. Grace watched his breathing. Slow. Even. Warm. She was still adjusting to that word. Warm. Her body remained tense under the covers. The habit of light sleep hadn't disappeared just because the room was quiet. Every small sound reached her. The low hum of heat moving through the vents. The distant creak of the house settling. Somewhere downstairs, the faint click of a coffee machine turning on. Grace sat up slowly. The guest room felt larger now in the morning light. Simple furniture. Clean sheets. A small wooden dresser near the wall. Her shoes were placed neatly beside the door where she had left them. She remembered walking into the room last night. The hesitation she felt stepping across the threshold. The strange feeling of closing a door behind her without worrying about someone knocking a few minutes later. Lucas stirred slightly. Grace leaned over and adjusted the blanket again. He made a small sound and settled. Grace moved quietly out of bed and lifted him into her arms. His warmth spread across her chest immediately. She pressed her cheek lightly against his head. Outside the window, the snow had stopped. The street beyond the trees looked soft and untouched. Grace stood there for a moment, just watching. Downstairs, a chair moved across the floor. Michael. Grace could hear the difference in footsteps now. Kelly moved lighter, faster. Michael's steps were slower, measured. Grace carried Lucas toward the door. She hesitated with her hand on the handle. Not fear, just that same careful instinct. She opened it quietly. The hallway was empty. A faint smell of coffee drifted upward. Grace walked down the stairs slowly. Lucas stayed asleep against her shoulder. Michael stood in the kitchen when she reached the bottom. He looked up when he heard the soft sound of her steps. Morning, he said. Grace nodded slightly. Morning. Michael poured coffee into a mug and set it on the counter. You sleep all right? Grace thought about the question, then nodded again. Yes. Not perfect sleep, but real sleep. Michael seemed to understand the difference. There's breakfast, if you want some, he said. Grace stepped into the kitchen slowly. The room was bright with morning light reflecting off the snow outside. Michael had already placed a small plate of toast and eggs on the counter. Grace looked at it. You didn't have to. I was making some anyway. Grace held Lucas closer for a moment. He began waking again, his small face shifting against her shoulder. Michael noticed. There's a chair there, he said, nodding toward the table. Grace sat carefully. Lucas opened his eyes slowly. His tiny mouth moved as he stretched. Grace smiled faintly. You're awake now. Michael watched the small moment quietly while he sipped his coffee. Lucas made a soft sound. Grace adjusted the blanket and settled him in her arms. The movement was gentle and practiced. Michael looked down at his mug. You said you've been here about 6 months, he said. Grace nodded. Lucas drank quietly. Michael didn't push the conversation. He simply waited. Grace stared down at Lucas while he fed. Then she spoke. I came for work. Michael raised his eyes slightly. What kind of work? Grace paused. My friend said there was a job at a cafe. Michael nodded. Did you get it? Grace shook her head slowly. They filled the position. Lucas finished feeding and made a small, satisfied sound. Grace rested him against her shoulder again. He's quiet, Michael said. Grace gave a small smile. Most of the time. Lucas burped softly. Grace wiped his mouth with the corner of the blanket. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair. What about before that? He asked gently. Grace's eyes moved toward the window. Snow still clung to the branches outside. For a moment, it seemed like she might not answer. Then she spoke quietly. I used to paint. Michael blinked slightly. Paint? Grace nodded. Murals. Signs. Sometimes portraits. Michael studied her face. You're an artist. Grace didn't react to the word. She just looked down at Lucas again. I was. The correction was small but clear. Michael didn't argue. Instead, he asked, Why stop? Grace adjusted Lucas again. Her fingers moved slowly across the blanket. Life changed. Michael nodded once. That was enough explanation for now. Lucas stretched his tiny arms. Grace kissed the top of his head without thinking. Michael noticed that too. You still paint? He asked. Grace shook her head. No supplies. Michael looked toward the window again. You ever think about starting again? Grace didn't answer. Lucas made another soft sound. Grace held him closer. The room stayed quiet. A few seconds passed before Kelly's footsteps appeared on the stairs. She came down quickly, still pulling a sweater over her head. Her hair was slightly messy. She stopped when she saw Grace and Lucas sitting at the table. Her face brightened. Good morning. Grace nodded politely. Morning. Kelly walked into the kitchen and leaned over slightly to see Lucas. He looks happy. Grace smiled faintly again. He's warm. Kelly glanced at her father, then back at Grace. You can stay today, she said. Grace looked surprised. I should probably go. Where? Kelly asked. Grace hesitated. Her eyes moved briefly toward the door. Michael spoke calmly. You don't have to rush. Grace looked between them. Kelly poured herself a cup of coffee. You said the shelters were full last night, she added. Grace nodded slowly. They usually stay full after holidays. Kelly leaned against the counter. So maybe you stay here today. Grace didn't answer right away. Lucas yawned. Grace rubbed his back gently. I don't want to cause problems, she said. Michael looked at her carefully. You're not. Grace studied his expression. Still searching for the catch. Still expecting something that hadn't appeared. Michael held her gaze calmly. The room stayed quiet again. Finally, Grace looked down at Lucas. Then she nodded once. Just today. Kelly smiled. That's a good start. Grace didn't return the smile, but her shoulders lowered slightly again. Another small piece of tension leaving. Michael finished his coffee and set the mug down. He looked at Grace. You said you paint murals. Grace nodded cautiously. Michael leaned back in his chair. I might know someone who needs one. Grace looked up. For the first time since she had arrived, curiosity replaced caution in her expression. And Michael noticed it immediately. A small shift, but real. The kind of shift that sometimes begins changing a life without anyone realizing it yet. Grace didn't answer Michael right away. Lucas had begun drifting back to sleep again, his small body heavy against her shoulder. She moved one hand slowly along his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. You know someone? She asked after a moment. Michael nodded. A community center downtown. They've been fixing the building for months. Grace listened. They wanted something on the outside wall, he continued. Something simple, something that makes the place feel less empty. Grace's fingers paused against Lucas's blanket. Why are you telling me? Michael held her gaze calmly. Because you said you paint. Grace looked down again. That was a long time ago. Michael didn't respond to that directly. Instead he asked, do you miss it? Grace inhaled slowly. The question seemed to land somewhere deeper than the others. Her eyes moved toward the window again. Snow still clung to the branches outside, but sunlight had started breaking through in thin, pale lines. I used to paint every day, she said quietly. Kelly leaned against the counter, listening without interrupting. Grace continued. Walls, signs, sometimes inside restaurants, sometimes on buildings. Michael nodded slightly. Grace's voice remained calm, but something in it had shifted. My father taught me. The words came out slowly. Kelly's expression softened. Was he an artist too? Grace shook her head. No. She adjusted Lucas gently. He fixed houses. Kelly waited. Grace's mouth curved faintly, but he liked color. Michael listened carefully. Grace continued after a few seconds. When I was younger, he would bring home leftover paint from jobs. Her voice grew quieter as she remembered. He'd let me paint the shed behind our house. Kelly smiled slightly. What did you paint? Grace thought about it. Everything. The word carried a trace of something lighter. Michael noticed it. Grace looked down again, but that was before. The shift returned. Michael didn't ask what before meant. Not yet. Lucas stirred slightly and made a soft noise. Grace rocked him gently until he settled again. Kelly crossed the room and sat at the table. Do you think you'd want to try again? She asked. Grace hesitated. Maybe. Michael stood from his chair and walked to the window. He looked out at the quiet street for a moment. Then he spoke. I could call them today. Grace's eyes lifted quickly. You don't even know if I'm good. Michael turned slightly. You painted murals. Grace gave a small shrug. That doesn't mean they were good. Kelly laughed softly. You're very cautious. Grace didn't smile. I have to be. The room grew quiet again. Michael leaned one hand against the window frame. People who paint murals usually care about how things look to other people, he said. Grace looked at him. That's part of it. What's the other part? Kelly asked. Grace considered the question. Then she said something simple. You leave something behind. Michael nodded once. That sounds useful. Grace studied his face again. You really think someone would let me paint their wall? Michael answered calmly. Yes. Grace didn't speak. Her eyes moved toward Lucas again. She adjusted the blanket carefully around him. Kelly watched her for a moment. Do you still draw? She asked. Grace shook her head. Not since Lucas was born. Kelly tilted her head slightly. Why? Grace looked down at her hands. I sold my supplies. The words came out flat. Michael understood immediately. Rent, food, travel. The small costs that add up when life starts breaking apart. Kelly looked thoughtful. You could borrow mine. Grace blinked. You paint? Kelly smiled faintly. Not well. Grace looked uncertain again. You don't have to be good to draw, Kelly added. Grace studied her for a moment. Then she nodded slightly. Maybe. Michael watched the exchange quietly. The morning light had grown stronger now, filling the kitchen with a soft glow reflecting off the snow outside. Lucas shifted again. Grace stood slowly and moved toward the living room couch. She sat carefully and laid Lucas down beside her on the cushion. He stayed asleep. Grace reached for the blanket and tucked it around him. Kelly followed her into the living room. "I'll grab the sketchbook," she said. Grace watched her disappear upstairs. Michael remained near the kitchen doorway. Grace looked around the room again. The same careful observation from last night, but something about it had changed. Not measuring danger anymore. Just noticing. Her eyes landed on the photograph near the fireplace again. Michael standing beside Kelly years earlier. Grace stood and walked slowly toward it. She studied the picture. Kelly younger. Michael smiling. Grace spoke quietly. "She looks like her mother." Michael turned slightly. "She does?" Grace glanced at him. "Where is she?" Michael answered simply. "She passed away." Grace's expression softened immediately. "I'm sorry." Michael nodded once. "Thank you." The conversation ended there. Not because it was uncomfortable, because both of them understood there wasn't much more to say about it. Kelly returned carrying a sketchbook and a small box of pencils. She handed them carefully to Grace. Grace looked down at the supplies. Her fingers brushed the edge of the sketchbook slowly, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to touch it. Kelly noticed. "It's just paper," she said gently. Grace gave a small breath. Then she sat back down on the couch. Lucas slept beside her. Grace opened the sketchbook. The first page was blank. She stared at it for a moment. Then she picked up a pencil. Her hand hovered above the page. Still. Michael watched from the doorway. Kelly sat quietly in the chair nearby. Grace finally lowered the pencil. The first line appeared slowly across the page. Not confident. Not hesitant either. Just careful. The kind of line someone draws when remembering something they haven't touched in a long time. Grace didn't speak while she worked. Neither did Michael or Kelly. The room remained quiet except for the faint sound of pencil against paper. Lucas slept peacefully beside her, and slowly, line by line, something that had been buried under months of survival began to return. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly finding its way back. The way many important things do. The first drawing took nearly an hour. Grace didn't rush it. The pencil moved slowly across the page while the room stayed quiet around her. Kelly had turned on a small lamp near the couch, even though daylight still filled the windows. It made the paper easier to see. Michael stood in the kitchen doorway for a while before eventually sitting down again. None of them spoke much. Grace's focus stayed on the page. Lucas slept through most of it, curled against the cushion beside her. When Grace finally stopped, she leaned back slightly and studied the sketch. Kelly leaned forward from the chair. "Can I see?" Grace hesitated. Then she turned the book slightly. It wasn't complicated, just the front wall of a building. Windows sketched lightly, a long empty space along the side where a mural could stretch across the brick. Kelly stared at it. "You already started planning it." Grace shrugged a little. "It's easier when you imagine the space first." Michael walked over slowly and looked down at the page. "You did that from memory?" Grace nodded. "Most community buildings look similar." Michael studied the lines carefully. They were steady. Not perfect, but confident in a quiet way. "You said you haven't drawn in months," he said. Grace closed the sketchbook halfway. "Hands remember things." Lucas stirred beside her. Grace reached down automatically and rested her hand lightly against his stomach. He settled again. Michael returned to the kitchen table and picked up his phone. Grace noticed, but didn't ask anything. He stepped into the other room and made a short call. His voice stayed low. Grace couldn't hear the full conversation. Only pieces. "Yes, today, someone I trust. Just a look." A few minutes later, he returned. Kelly looked up immediately. "Well?" Michael slipped the phone back into his pocket. "They want to meet her." Grace froze slightly. "Meet me?" Michael nodded. Grace shook her head. "No." Kelly frowned. "Why?" Grace closed the sketchbook. "I can't just show up somewhere like that." Michael spoke calmly. "It's just a conversation." Grace stood from the couch and picked Lucas up again. Her voice stayed controlled, but the tension had returned. I don't have a portfolio. You have a sketch, Kelly said. Grace shook her head again. That's not enough. Michael watched her carefully. Grace, she looked at him. You said you used to paint murals. Yes. So show them. Grace shifted Lucas higher against her shoulder. That was before. Michael leaned slightly against the kitchen counter. Before what? Grace didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough that Kelly began to understand something deeper was sitting under the conversation. Grace walked toward the window slowly. Lucas rested quietly against her chest again. I had a gallery job once, she said after a moment. Michael waited. They let local artists display work in the back room. Kelly's eyes widened slightly. That's amazing. Grace shook her head. It didn't last. What happened? Michael asked gently. Grace looked outside. The snow in the yard had started melting where the sunlight touched it. The owner changed. Her voice stayed steady. He wanted different art. Michael understood immediately. What kind? Grace answered quietly. The kind that sells quickly. Kelly tilted her head. What's wrong with that? Grace turned slightly toward her. Nothing. Then she added softly, unless your work doesn't. Kelly didn't speak. Grace continued. I kept painting anyway. Lucas made a soft sound. Grace adjusted him gently. But eventually, rent comes first. The words landed heavier than the others. Michael nodded slowly. Grace looked back at the sketchbook still resting on the couch. That's why I sold the supplies. The room went quiet again. Michael didn't push further. Instead, he said something simple. You're not asking them for a job. Grace looked at him. You're showing them what you can do. Grace held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at Lucas again. I don't know if I can start again. Michael stepped a little closer. You already did. He nodded toward the sketchbook. Grace glanced at it. Kelly stood and picked it up carefully. She flipped to the drawing. You did this without even seeing the wall. Grace didn't argue. Kelly closed the book and handed it back to her. Just talk to them. Grace looked uncertain. Michael's voice stayed calm. If you hate the idea, after 5 minutes, we leave. Grace studied his face, still searching, still expecting a condition hidden somewhere in the offer. But there wasn't one. Lucas yawned softly. Grace kissed the top of his head. Then she sighed quietly. When? Michael checked the time on the clock. Late afternoon. Grace nodded slowly, not fully convinced, but not refusing any more either. Kelly smiled slightly. I'll come with you. Grace looked surprised. You don't have to. Kelly shrugged. I want to see the mural. Grace looked down at the sketchbook again. Her fingers rested along the edge of the cover. For a moment the room stayed still. Then she said something very softly. Okay. Michael didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Grace sat back down on the couch and opened the sketchbook again. Lucas slept against her shoulder. The pencil returned to the page. This time the lines came faster, more certain. Michael watched quietly from across the room. Outside, the snow continued melting under the winter sun. Inside the house, something that had almost disappeared was slowly beginning to take shape again. Not just a drawing, something deeper, something that had been waiting for the right moment to breathe again. And none of them fully understood yet how much that single afternoon meeting might change the direction of all their lives. The drive downtown was quieter than the night before. Snow had turned into wet slush along the roads, and the sky carried that pale winter color that never quite becomes bright, even in the afternoon. Grace sat in the back seat again. Lucas rested inside a borrowed carrier Kelly had found in the storage closet. He slept through most of the ride, wrapped in the same thick blanket from the house. Grace held the sketchbook in her lap. She hadn't opened it since they left. Her fingers stayed resting on the cover. Not nervous exactly, just careful. Michael noticed it in the mirror. You don't have to show them today, he said. Grace looked up slightly. I thought that was the point. Michael nodded. It is. A small pause. But you're allowed to change your mind. Grace thought about that. Then she shook her head once. No. Kelly turned halfway in the passenger seat. You're brave, you know. Grace gave a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. No, I'm just tired of being stuck. The car slowed as they turned onto a narrower street lined with older brick buildings. Some of them had fresh paint and new signs. Others looked like they had been waiting years for someone to notice them again. Michael pulled into a small parking lot beside a two-story building with scaffolding along one side. Paint buckets and ladders sat stacked near the wall. Grace studied the building carefully. That's the place? Michael nodded. The mural would go right there. He pointed toward a wide brick wall facing the street. It was empty. Bare red brick stretching nearly 30 feet across. Grace stared at it. Her mind moved quickly now. Shapes, color, light. She could already see pieces forming. Kelly noticed the shift in her expression. What are you thinking? Grace didn't answer right away. Finally, she said quietly, It gets good sunlight in the afternoon. Michael glanced at the wall again. You're already planning. Grace looked down quickly. Just noticing. They stepped out of the car. The air felt colder here between the buildings, but the sky was clear now. Michael led them toward the front entrance. Inside, the building smelled faintly like fresh paint and wood dust. A tall man stood near a folding table covered with blueprints. He looked up as they entered. Michael. Michael shook his hand. Tom. Tom glanced toward Grace and Kelly. And this must be the artist you mentioned. Grace shifted Lucas slightly in the carrier. I'm not sure about the word artist, she said quietly. Tom smiled. That's what people usually say when they're about to show me something good. Grace hesitated. Michael stayed silent. Tom gestured toward the empty wall outside the front windows. That's the canvas. Grace walked closer to the glass and looked at the brick again. Her eyes moved slowly across the surface, counting spaces, measuring lines in her head. Tom watched her carefully. You see something already, don't you? Grace nodded slightly. Maybe. Tom crossed his arms. Well? Grace turned and held the sketchbook a little tighter. Then she opened it. The pages flipped once, twice, until she reached the drawing she had made that morning. She handed it over. Tom studied it quietly. No immediate reaction, just a slow examination of the lines. Michael waited. Kelly watched Tom's face. Grace stood very still. After nearly a full minute, Tom looked up. You did this today? Grace nodded. Yes. Tom turned the sketch slightly. You haven't even seen the wall in person. Grace shrugged a little. Walls are walls. Tom smiled faintly. Not always. He walked toward the window and held the sketch beside the real wall outside. The proportions were almost exact. Tom glanced back at Grace. How long did it take you? About an hour. Tom nodded slowly. Then he handed the sketchbook back. What would you paint? Grace hesitated again. Her eyes moved to the brick wall, then back to Tom. Something that belongs to the neighborhood. Tom raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Grace stepped closer to the window. People here walk past this building every day. She pointed lightly toward the sidewalk outside. So the mural should look like it's always been part of the street. Tom listened. Grace continued quietly. Maybe children running across the wall. She gestured along the brick with her hand. Maybe hands reaching toward light. Kelly watched her carefully. Grace's voice had changed. Not louder, but steadier. The hesitation from earlier had faded. Something hopeful, Grace finished. Tom leaned back slightly. That's a big wall, Grace nodded. I know. Tom looked at Michael briefly, then back at Grace. You've done something that size before? Grace answered honestly. Once. Tom considered that. Then he said something simple. All right. Grace blinked. All right? Tom nodded. Come back tomorrow and start sketching on the wall. Grace stared at him. You're serious? Tom shrugged. Your lines are steady. He pointed toward the sketchbook. And people who talk about light the way you just did usually know what they're doing. Grace didn't speak. For a moment, she just stood there holding the sketchbook. Kelly broke the silence first. That means you got the job. Tom laughed. It means she gets a chance. Grace looked down at Lucas sleeping peacefully against her chest, then back at the wall. Something moved quietly across her face. Not excitement, something deeper, relief. Michael saw it. Tom extended his hand. What do you say? Grace hesitated only a second this time. Then she shook his hand. Thank you. Tom nodded. Tomorrow morning. Grace stepped back toward Michael and Kelly. They walked outside again. The afternoon light had grown warmer. Grace stopped in the parking lot and looked at the wall once more. Her eyes followed the empty space across the bricks. Michael stood beside her. You're quiet, he said. Grace nodded. I forgot what this feels like. What? Grace held the sketchbook against her chest. Possibility. Kelly smiled softly. Lucas shifted in the carrier but stayed asleep. Grace looked down at him, then back at the wall. The future wasn't solved. Nothing about her life had suddenly become easy. But for the first time in months, something real had opened in front of her. Not charity, not survival, a door she could walk through herself. And standing there in the cold afternoon air, Grace understood something that hadn't been clear before. The night at the bus stop hadn't just saved her from the cold. It had quietly led her back toward the life she thought she had already lost. Grace arrived before anyone else the next morning. The air still held that early winter quiet where the city hadn't fully started moving yet. A thin layer of frost clung to the sidewalk, and the brick wall looked darker in the morning shade. Michael had offered to drive her again. Grace declined, not because she didn't appreciate the offer, but because walking there felt important. Lucas slept against her chest inside the carrier. His small breath warmed the inside of her coat as she stood across the street, looking at the wall. 30 feet. Maybe a little more. Yesterday it had looked intimidating. This morning it looked like a question waiting to be answered. Grace walked closer. The bricks were rougher than she expected. Small chips here and there. Old mortar lines running unevenly between them. She ran her fingers lightly across the surface. Texture mattered. Paint settled differently depending on how the wall held it. Lucas stirred slightly. Grace rested her hand against his back. It's okay, she whispered. The street behind her slowly came alive. A delivery truck rolled past. Someone unlocked the door of the bakery on the corner. Grace opened the sketchbook. She had filled 3 more pages the night before. Not detailed drawings, just shapes, movement, lines that suggested children running, arms lifted toward sunlight that didn't quite exist on the wall yet. Footsteps approached behind her. You're early. Grace turned. Tom walked across the sidewalk, holding 2 coffee cups. Grace nodded slightly. I wanted to see the wall again. Tom handed her one of the cups. Artists always do. Grace accepted it. The warmth spread into her hands immediately. Tom studied the wall. So, what do you see today? Grace looked back at the bricks. The light comes from that side in the afternoon. She pointed toward the corner of the street, so the figures should move toward it. Tom nodded. Show me. Grace opened a sketchbook again. The pages turned. Tom leaned closer. These are new, he said. Grace nodded. Last night. Tom smiled faintly. Looks like you didn't sleep much. Grace gave a small shrug. Lucas made a soft sound against her chest. Tom glanced down. He coming to work with you every day? Grace looked at Lucas. Yes. Tom nodded. Well, the wall won't mind. Grace closed the sketchbook. Tom stepped back. We'll get you paint this afternoon. Today you just map it out. Grace looked at the empty bricks again. The space still felt enormous, but now it felt possible. Tom pointed toward a ladder leaning against the scaffolding. Whenever you're ready. Grace stood still for a moment. Then she stepped toward the ladder. Lucas slept through the movement as she climbed. Each step brought her higher until the wall stretched wide in front of her. Grace pulled a small piece of charcoal from her pocket. Her hand hovered for a second. Not from fear, just the weight of the moment. Then she made the first mark, a single curved line across the brick. Tom watched from the sidewalk. Grace stepped back slightly and studied the line. Then she added another. Soon the empty wall began filling with faint charcoal shapes. Movement, arms reaching, children running across sunlight that didn't exist yet, but soon would. Lucas shifted again. Grace rested one hand gently on the carrier while continuing to draw with the other. The lines came faster now, more confident. Tom checked his watch once, then again. 2 hours passed before he finally stepped closer. "You sure you haven't done this in a while?" Grace climbed down the ladder and stepped back to see the full wall. The charcoal sketch stretched across nearly the entire brick surface. Not perfect, but alive. Grace shook her head. Not in a long time. Tom nodded. "Well, it shows." Grace looked up at the wall again. For the first time since arriving in the city, something she had made was visible again. Not hidden, not temporary, real. Lucas woke slowly. Grace lifted him from the carrier and held him against her shoulder. He blinked at the bright morning light. Tom studied the wall again. "You start painting tomorrow." Grace nodded. She didn't trust her voice at that moment. Tom finished his coffee and tossed the empty cup in a nearby bin. "Looks like you're back to work." Grace watched the charcoal lines across the wall. Back to work. The phrase carried more weight than Tom probably intended. Michael arrived about an hour later. Grace didn't notice at first. She stood across the street holding Lucas while studying the wall from a distance. Michael walked up beside her quietly. "You started." Grace glanced at him. "Yes." Michael followed her gaze toward the wall. The charcoal sketch stretched across the bricks like something waking up. He nodded slowly. "That's beautiful." Grace didn't respond right away. She looked down at Lucas, then back at the wall. "It's only the beginning." Michael understood. The mural wasn't the only thing starting to form. But neither of them said that out loud. They simply stood there together while the winter sun climbed higher above the street. And for the first time since that night at the bus stop, Grace looked like someone who had somewhere to go the next morning. The mural took 12 days. The first few were quiet. Grace arrived early every morning, usually before most of the shops opened along the street. Lucas stayed close to her, sometimes sleeping in the carrier, sometimes watching the movement of her brush with wide, curious eyes. At first, people walked past without stopping. They noticed the scaffolding, the paint buckets, the woman working slowly across the brick wall. But by the fourth day, the shapes started to make sense. The children appeared first, not detailed faces, just movement. Small figures running across the wall, their outlines stretched toward the bright space Grace left near the center. Then came the hands, reaching. Not desperate, just reaching upward, as if the light itself was something that could be touched. Grace worked carefully. Some afternoons she stepped back for long periods without painting at all, just studying the wall, letting the shapes settle in her mind before adding the next color. Michael stopped by often, not always speaking. Sometimes he simply stood across the street and watched the mural grow while Lucas slept beside Grace. Kelly visited too. She brought coffee, sometimes sandwiches, once a small box of new paintbrushes she had picked up at an art store. Grace tried to refuse them. Kelly placed the brushes on the ground anyway. "You need better tools," she said. Grace looked at them for a long moment before quietly saying, "Thank you." By the 8th day, people started slowing down when they passed. A man walking his dog stopped one morning and stared at the wall for nearly 5 minutes. A group of teenagers sat on the curb across the street watching Grace paint until the afternoon light faded. One of them finally called out, "Hey." Grace turned. "That's pretty cool." Grace gave a small nod. "Thank you." The boy pointed toward one of the painted figures. "That kid looks like my brother." Grace studied the wall again. "Maybe it is." The boy laughed. Word spread slowly. Nothing dramatic. Just neighbors mentioning it to each other while walking past. "Did you see the wall on 7th?" By the 10th day, the mural had color everywhere. Warm gold near the center where the sunlight touched the figures. Deep blues and soft greens spreading outward along the brick. The children running across the wall looked almost alive now. Grace added small details last. A shoelace trailing behind one child. The curve of a hand brushing against light. Michael arrived on the 12th morning and saw Grace standing across the street again. The mural was finished. She wasn't painting anymore, just looking. Lucas rested in her arms, wide awake now, staring at the wall as if he recognized something there. Michael walked up beside her. "You done?" Grace nodded. "I think so." Michael studied the wall. The children seemed to move across the brick even when you stood still. Light poured through the center of the painting, reaching outward across the figures like something being shared. People were already stopping again. A woman stood near the sidewalk, pointing it out to her daughter. Grace watched them quietly. "You left space here," Michael said. Grace followed his gaze. Near the bottom corner of the mural was a small open section of color. "Yes." "For what?" Grace shifted Lucas gently. "More children." Michael looked at her. "Later." Grace nodded. "Maybe." They stood there a while longer. Tom eventually stepped outside the building and joined them. He studied the finished mural carefully. "Well," he said. Grace waited. Tom nodded once. "Looks like it belongs here." Grace exhaled slowly. That was the only approval she needed. Over the next week, something unexpected happened. People started asking about the artist. A cafe owner down the street asked if Grace could paint a smaller mural inside his shop. A daycare center called Tom, asking for the woman who painted the running children. Grace accepted the first job slowly, then the second, not rushing, not assuming it would last forever, but accepting the work as it came. Michael helped where he could, sometimes watching Lucas for a few hours, sometimes driving Grace to buy supplies when the weather turned bad again. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Grace still worried about money, still woke up some nights listening for sounds that weren't there. But the days had changed, the mornings especially, because now they had direction. One evening near the end of January, Grace sat in the living room of Michael's house again. Lucas slept beside her on the couch. Kelly sat on the floor sketching something in her own notebook. Michael stood near the window looking out at the quiet street. Grace watched them for a moment. The house felt familiar now. Not borrowed, not temporary. Just familiar. She spoke quietly. "I found an apartment." Kelly looked up quickly. "That's good." Grace nodded. "It's small." Michael turned from the window. "Small is fine." Grace studied Lucas sleeping peacefully beside her. "I can move in next week." Kelly smiled faintly. "You'll be close to the mural." Grace nodded. "Yes." The room grew quiet again. Grace looked around the house slowly. The same shelves, the same photographs near the fireplace. The place where everything had started without anyone planning it. She spoke again. "You didn't have to stop that night." Michael met her eyes. "No." Grace rested her hand lightly on Lucas's back. "But you did." Michael nodded once. Grace looked down at her son. Then she said something very softly. "Thank you." Michael didn't answer right away. He simply sat down across from her. The quiet stretched comfortably between them. Outside, winter continued moving through the city. Inside the house, something steady had formed between three people who hadn't known each other a month earlier. Not charity, not obligation. Something simpler, a kind of belonging that arrives slowly, without announcement. Grace looked at Lucas again, then back at Michael and Kelly, and for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she could build.